CI/CD security and compliance with Jenkins and OpsMx. My name is Mark Levy, and I'll be hosting today's webinar. I focus on product marketing here at OpsMx. Before we start, a few housekeeping items. Today's session is going to be about 45 minutes long. We're recording the session. We'll send you the recording and slides, everybody. If you have any questions, please answer. We'll answer as many questions as we can. Put them in the chat. Bob, if you could go to the next slide. Those of you who don't know much about OpsMx or are new to OpsMx, OpsMx delivers software and services to intelligently secure and automate software delivery, leveraging an open DevOps architecture and deployment firewall to empower enterprises to ship secure software faster. I'd like to introduce today's speaker. Bob Boulay brings over 20 years of solution engineering expertise to his role as VP of Products. With his deep technical knowledge and talent for explaining complex systems, Bob is an expert on topics like Jenkins security and CI/CD. Bob's hands-on experience enables him to quickly grasp how technologies work and convey that understanding to others. I'm sure you will enjoy his presentation. Good morning, Bob.
Mark, thank you. Thank you for such a kind introduction. And we'll see if I can live up to the billing. So I appreciate that. And thank you everyone for joining us. I think these events are on my side, they're always fun, and I'm hoping on your side they can be very informative. So let me give you a quick rundown of sort of what we're going to talk about today. And I thought I'd start off with an evolution of Jenkins and sort of why it's important, right? I don't think there's going to be any net new here, but I think we're looking at this from the perspective of secure software delivery and sort of how do we augment or how do we help with security and compliance in the software delivery lifecycle when folks are leveraging Jenkins, both in a CI and CD context. Quick overview of the Jenkins landscape. A small architecture diagram there that I'll show you that I think is sort of more of a reference architecture, but I think it gives us a great spot to sort of talk about the topic, and then get into some of the security gaps in the ecosystem, right? I think at the end of the day, what we want to talk to you about today is sort of how we help you firm up some of those security and compliance gaps, right? I think that there's a lot of sort of work that happens at the developer level. I think we all know that security is everyone's job, but I think what we'll talk about today is sort of where some of those gaps live and sort of how we can help sort of address some of those things. And then I think again, how do we augment security in that ecosystem? I think I just talked about that, and then we'll get into Deploy Shield and sort of how we can help manage audit compliance via the software bill of materials. And then obviously we'll do a quick tour of Deploy Shield, but I want to show you sort of what it is that we're suggesting or what it is that we're recommending, and then we'll leave some time for questions. So let's get into it, guys. Obviously when we think about Jenkins, because I think you might look at a topic like this and say, gee, why did you choose Jenkins to focus on, right? Why did you choose the Jenkins ecosystem? And I think Jenkins, both in its sort of evolution as an open source tool, and then obviously, with companies like CloudBees coming along and doing some augmentation there and support. I think they've it's really the table stakes product for automation and integration and deployment, right? So Jenkins automatically pulls builds, tests, deploys code, and allows teams to detect integration bugs early in the featured fixes in that cycle. So I think it's really sort of become a mainstay in a lot of dev organizations. Obviously, the other thing there that as sort of a success story around open source communities and open source architecture, I think the extensibility with plugins, right? I think we've seen the Jenkins sort of really sort of evolve over time, right? It's never out of date, right? It's never sort of behind because it's got such a robust community. Now again, I think there are some commercial entities that are sort of leveraging that and helping move that along as well, but I think a lot of those places like CloudBees do a nice job of contributing back as well. So it's sort of stayed current through that robust community and through the ability to sort of make it so that it's easy to create and deploy plugins to that ecosystem. The scalability and distributed builds, again, I think this is something that is a huge leap forward, or was a huge leap forward. When you think about open source tooling, you think, well, they're gonna make it for the everyman, but they might not scale. That might be one of the problems. Jenkins has, certainly the community has certainly responded to that over time. And then integration with tools platforms. I think one of the things that we always see is an explosion of tools in the CI/CD ecosystem, whether those tools be related to code quality and testing, or with the use of open source security, open source license compliance. There are literally hundreds of tools that could be in any given sort of ecosystem there. And I think the integration with those tools, again, is a testament to, sort of Jenkins as a community, and Jenkins as, sort of a system that has been essentially evergreen within the CI/CD community. And I think, I pulled this stat out. I was cruising around the other day looking for, some stats that would be powerful. And I think, you look at this, and this was right out of a CD Foundation press release on August 29th, so it's current. The recent market share for statistics from Data and Eyes shows that Jenkins has an estimated 44% of the CI/CD market. That's huge when you consider some of the competitors, right? And you consider some of the tools that are out there. And I think where it even gets more interesting is, if there are approximately 25 million developers globally, 44% market share means approximately 11.2 million developers are using Jenkins. That's a testament to the product itself. And while from an OpsMx perspective, we look at CD and OpenCD as Spinnaker and Argo types of scenarios. We certainly do have to tip our cap to sort of what Jenkins has managed to do in becoming a mainstay in the CI/CD ecosystem. And I think those numbers just speak for themselves. And so that's why we're here, right, guys? I think from my perspective anyway, I think this is one of those things where there's a lot of you out there using this, and we want to make sure that we help you understand sort of how we might be able to help you manage some of the areas that Jenkins has chosen not to address, right? And so I think if we start looking at sort of landscape of an ecosystem here, right? And this is just something that is quick and dirty that was put together here at OpsMx. And as you can see, when you sort of plug Jenkins in, up here under the continuous integration, we've chosen to plug Spinnaker in here. However, I could very easily move Jenkins over here as well with some of the CD plugins that are available for Jenkins. And so, but I think primarily the mainstay here around Jenkins has been around its CI, and then people have started to say, well, I'm already familiar with this tool. Let me go ahead and extend it to start to be able to do deployments. And so looking at some of those plugins around Jenkins and CD. But again, I think if you look here, you see, sort of where it fits into that ecosystem. And I think, when you look at the code development piece, and you look at sort of source control, source code management, static code analysis, and by the way, there's a whole bunch of other stuff here that it needs to be added in if we were to be really comprehensive, right? So you might add vulnerability management systems there. You would add things like open source vulnerability or open source license control management. You might add unit testing or a whole bunch of other things there that ultimately result in all these checks that are going to happen, and then ultimately that continuous integration piece where you get the piece where it's going to go through and actually perform the build and run some tests on that build, and then ultimately pass it over to the CD system once it deposits those artifacts in an artifact repository. So again, I think if you look here, Jenkins is sort of well ingrained in this process. And I think for those of you that are using it, both in the context of continuous integration, as well as continuous deployment, or at least deployment in general, right? I think this is something where we'll talk today about how we can help, not necessarily fill, because these aren't necessarily faults of Jenkins. I think this is sort of just a general consensus that there's a distributed set of tooling that ultimately is going to be used to manage security and to manage compliance. And I think what we want to talk about today is, sort of how we can help with that, and how we can help when Jenkins is sort of the center of that ecosystem. And so that's, I think, what our goal is today. But I thought I'd be remiss if I didn't, sort of bring up some context, right, in sort of where we see Jenkins fitting in and sort of how it fits in. And like I said, I could very easily replace Spinnaker with Jenkins here if I needed to or wanted to, if that was sort of the shop that I was running. I certainly could go down that path. And again, for us, it doesn't really matter, right? It doesn't really matter. I think we're gonna use the same sets of technologies to help you sort of fill some of those gaps and some of those voids. So when we look at the gaps, right, and we look at the security gaps in the ecosystem, again, I think, a lot of what has gone on in the last 5 to 10 years has been sort of that shift left movement in security. Let's make sure that we ingrain security into our developers. Let's make sure we take that attitude that security is everyone's job, right? And so we've got a whole bunch of now very security-minded developers, which is a phenomenal thing for all of us, frankly, that are leveraging tools to do things like static code analysis, code quality checks, vulnerability management. You want to, be looking at potentially the efficacy of any of the dependencies that you're bringing in, both build time and runtime, right? And understand, the composition of those things and any security threats that those things represent. And then ultimately, all those checks are happening, right? And ultimately they're being passed along once we get past all that, right, in terms of the developer process. Then we get into the build process. Then this is the void, right? So now, sort of the world stops, right? From a deployment perspective, and for some things that's okay, right? Because if the code's not going to change, I do need proof that that gate was cleared in terms of static code analysis and some of those other things. But there are a lot of dynamics in this particular scenario. So the world of vulnerabilities doesn't change. They're constantly being introduced or being uncovered. Some of them were there when you wrote the code or brought that dependency in, but based on things like responsible disclosure, there's a delay in the world sort of understanding what's going on there. So I think this part here in between sort of build and deploy is really where I think we've identified a gap, right, in terms of how do we, one, make sure that we're auditing and reporting that all of the checks that were supposed to have happened are indeed happening. And then how do we make sure that we're continuing to check for those items that are dynamic? And then I think the other piece of this is, if my organization has a set of standards and boundaries around software deployment, how do I codify that? So if I have an SDLC, how do I take the things that are outside of the traditional scenarios and actually go ahead and codify those checks to make sure that they're being complied with? Or if I were to say, hey, my organization being highly regulated, we're going to go ahead and actually adopt a risk framework like NIST 853 or something along those lines, PCI. There's all those types of frameworks out there. I need to make sure that I'm baking all of those controls into the deployment process, right? And so this is really where I think we can start to help fill that security void. And of course, Jenkins plays a role, right, in terms of that initial CI, and then ultimately Jenkins may live over here as well if we were to be creative and say it's going to do the deploy. But it's in between those things, right? It's in between the initial code check-in and the continuous integration testing and the build. That and between that and deploy is really where I think we've assessed the fact that there is a security void there. And so that's the void that we want to talk about filling today. Now, if you might be asking yourself, well, how are you guys going to do this, right? So what is the high level overview of that Jenkins ecosystem, and sort of how are we going to go about doing this? So this is a great question, and I think the question here is not inventing a better mousetrap, right, in terms of what SonarQube does, or what aquasec does, or what black duck or sneak does, right? We don't want to displace any of those tools. As a matter of fact, whether you're an open source stack or you've got sort of open source augmented with some commercial tooling, our attitude here is those things have a job to do. We're just there to make sure that, one, we can prove that they did their job, but then two, we can continue to poke those things to make sure they do their job all the way right up to before the deployment process, to make sure that we're not uncovering any net new items that are there. And then ultimately, so if you look at this architecture for a moment, there's a couple things I want to point out. One is, there's a secure delivery management and governance layer. This is essentially what we call our data warehouse, right? So if you think about sort of what we were proposing, we want to drop in, or a solution that needs to drop in and ultimately start collecting data from all of these tools, right? So we want to be out in front of, collecting information, understanding what's going on at each step of the process, and ultimately being able to aggregate all of that information. Now, once we've started down the process of aggregating that information, then we can actually start through a logical layer that we call the deployment firewall. The deployment firewall is simply something, and we'll take a closer look at this in a moment. The deployment firewall is something that will simply go down the path of saying, hey, I know I've got all this data on one side, and then I've got a list of rules, right, or policies, if you will, that I want to make sure, I need to make sure are enforced. So I can use the data in a value in the data layer and take this logical layer and start to analyze that data in the context of some of these rules. Some of these rules might be simple, like, hey, I'm a retail operation and I don't do any deployments between November 1st and January 15th, right? Or, hey, I want to make sure that just before I deploy to production, or I promote from staging to production, that there aren't any critical vulnerabilities or high vulnerabilities that have come into play based on the software composition that I've used to build my images, right? So I want to make sure that that's the case. Or, I might use the deployment firewall to say, hey, I want to analyze the changes that are going to be made to the infrastructure as code deployment that I'm doing out in front of this. And again, all of these things are going to go through and be part of a Jenkins ecosystem. You're going to be using Jenkins in theory to do your CI and run your builds. And then ultimately, you're going to be using, in some cases, Jenkins to do your deploy. But what you don't have access to, and you have integrations to do sort of point in time pieces, but what we want to do is we want to create that data warehouse and to be able to, as you'll see a little bit later in the program, that ability to go ahead and actually analyze these things just before a deployment. And because our DNA is in deployment, we're going to be able to go ahead and actually help you craft those rules. We ship with a set of rules that are already crafted that are, again, along those lines of things like NIST 853. But again, the idea is taking those things and making sure that everything complies before the deployment, and making sure that there aren't any gaps in the security just before that deployment goes out. And again, I think this is particularly powerful in the Jenkins ecosystem, mainly because, again, it's a tool that you can operate at scale, right? So if any of this stuff is around a single pipeline, or as I like to say, it's the whole operation's not bigger than a bread box, then you probably don't need something like this, right? But however, when you start to want to operate at scale, and Jenkins is one of those tools that unlocks your ability to operate at that scale, this all becomes very, very difficult to do and to match the velocity of deployments that your company or your customers demand, depending on the business you're in, right? So now, with that said, I wanted to zone in on a little bit on, what we call the deployment firewall. And I think this is something that, again, from a conceptual perspective, is pretty simple, right? It's, you have data being collected on one side, you have a set of rules on the other, and then ultimately as deployments move through that process, right? So as a deployment goes from a dev system to a QA system to a staging system, we are constantly, first off, ingesting things like the software bill of materials, right? So we understand the software composition, and then pulling in data that's associated with that pipeline, right, from any of the tooling that you have in your ecosystem. So whether that be vulnerability management, license management, any of the software composition tools that are looking at code quality, unit testing, all of those things, Jenkins itself, right? So we're going to be pulling Jenkins data into this stack as well, and then taking that and not only evaluating it against a set of rules to see if it's eligible for deployment, which we'll talk about here a little bit in the demo, but also being able to craft what we call a delivery bill of materials, right? So that I now have a system of record that's going to tell me every step of the way what checks happened, what checks failed. Not only is this going to make sure that I'm not delivering anything that has a high risk associated with it, but that I'm also living up to my SDLC, and I can provide proof that I'm sort of living the life that my SDLC outlines, right? The other thing that I think is always interesting, and I always like to talk to people about this, and it's one of those things where people never like to think it could happen, but it can, right? Especially in larger organizations where, back here, if you have a bad actor and they are forcing things through, or they've gamed the system and figured out how to get things through, you need a circuit breaker there as well. And so we're sort of really sort of looking to add that layer of protection to help you make sure that your organization is living up to those deployment standards. And I think, when we think about, what's challenging in securing software delivery, I think, the attack surfaces are growing and they're extremely dynamic. So I'll tell you, what the bad guys have figured out is it's getting harder and harder to, create havoc or problems in deployed systems, right? That piece is evolving. And while it's still possible, I mean, anything's possible, those are no longer soft targets. And so those attackers are now looking for those soft targets. And so they're shifting left, right? And they're looking for spots where they can exploit the deployment chain, right? Or the software delivery chain. It doesn't matter to them where their malicious code gets in, as long as it gets in. The security processes and the data itself are scattered and siloed, right? So let's assume for a second that you're using Jenkins to do CI and CD, and you've got another tool to do code quality scanning, and you've got another tool to look at things like open source efficacy, open source licensing, and you got another tool to do vulnerability management, right? So these things all add up, right? And on their surface, you're building out what we would call a best of breed approach, right, to making sure of this stuff. But again, it becomes scattered and siloed. Responding to problems becomes an issue because you don't really know where to go. And then this idea of compliance and being able to prove that you've done what you say you're going to do, again, problematic for a lot of customers, right? This is what we're seeing out in the market. Manual approvals, again, with systems like Jenkins, you still need to have, like, I'll give a great example is, things like separation of duties, right? So how do I enforce separation of duties? Well, it's easy enough to create a manual approval to say, hey, I need somebody from one organization and somebody from another organization, and neither one of them could be developers, because I don't want developers deploying code. So it might be somebody from SRE, it might be someone from DevSecOps. But I think that idea of manual approvals and being able to ultimately track those things so you can automate a process. Vulnerability tracking, again, freezing code doesn't freeze the constantly changing vulnerability landscape, right? So I'm bringing in X number of dependencies that are using X number of open source libraries that, are constantly shifting in terms of their vulnerability profile. So we want to, again, we're not suggesting changing tools. What we're suggesting is making sure that it doesn't stop at build, right? It doesn't stop at code check-in, that you're constantly checking those things. And then obviously, when it comes time to things, when you get an audit around a SOC 2 type 2 audit or ISO 27001 audit, where these manual audits can be expensive and time consuming, right? And if you don't have a single source of truth for all this information, it can become very difficult to execute on those audits in a sort of an efficient way without tying up resources that, quite frankly, could be doing other things to add value to your organization. And that's why I think, one of the things that we talked about here too, that is an extension. We like to think of ourselves as a way to extend the value that you're getting from Jenkins, is to not stop at the software bill of materials, right? It's not enough. We want to incorporate what we're calling the delivery bill of materials. So we're bringing, again, all this data together from Jenkins, from SonarQube, from Sneak, from Black Duck, from Name Tool, right? And then again, I think what we're doing is we're bringing all that information in and creating an official record of that deployment process, right? We're also constantly evaluating that information against our logical layer, which is that deployment firewall, to sort of see where those problems are. And then obviously there needs to be a facility to very cleanly bring you back into that tool, because one of the things that we've learned, and I think we all understand this, anybody that's been in this game long enough understands, you don't want to just see another pretty dashboard, right? You don't want to just, because let's face it, none of us have time to sit there and keep hitting the refresh button on our browsers as we stare at a dashboard, right? The management needs to be through exceptions, right? So we needed a system that was going to ultimately evaluate this data and tell us where the problems are, warn us when there's an issue, bring us back to the tool to actually take action against that issue, right? I don't want to have to stare at a dashboard then wonder what to do. I want to be able to sort of come back and say, hey, I got an alert. There's a problem here. Let me evaluate it. Let me go ahead and decide what to do about it, and then move on with my day. And so that's where I think the software bill of materials it leaves off, and the delivery bill of materials picks up, is the ability to go ahead and do exactly what I've just suggested. Now, with that all said, let me give you guys a preview of sort of what we are proposing as a solution, right? And I think, when we look at this stuff, I think it's really critical to basically be able to sort of show you sort of what it is that we're proposing. Now, again, for the purposes of our webinar today, of course, we want to assume that you're using Jenkins for both CI and CD, right? You're leveraging Jenkins to its fullest extent. We're tapped into Jenkins, right? So we understand not only the software composition and the pieces that are associated with those pipelines that are living in Jenkins, and we're bringing that stuff down. Then we're marrying that stuff up to the various data that we're collecting, right? So whether that be from AWS infrastructure, or from Sneak, or some other sort of vulnerability management tool, we'll look at SonarQube and some of the other tooling that we can bring in. And so our immediate, or our sort of entry point to the solution, is around an application risk dashboard, right? Where we're doing an assessment, a constant assessment of the data that we're receiving, and ultimately going down the path of saying, what risk does this represent? And so if we were to drill into one of these high risk applications, we can see, sort of the vulnerability assessment is where we land, right? And so obviously, as we look at this, we've drilled into an application. Now we're seeing all the services that are out there, and an understanding of the vulnerabilities, and overall the alerts, because alerts becomes Deploy Shield stock and trade, right? Alerts are our way of signaling to you that there's a problem, right? And so when we look at this, we look at the alerts, that are there, we can say, hey, I've got, in this particular case, a couple of high and a critical vulnerability, and then I can drill into that and say, well, what do we need to do here, right? So I might look at this might, as part of our RBAC model and as part of our RACI model, in terms of how we allow you to define your teams, we might be bringing in the security analyst that's associated with this application. That person may analyze this and say, you know what, this isn't exploitable, right now, the way we're deploying it. However, we do have policy in our SDLC against deploying high and critical vulnerabilities, so we've got to do something. However, what I am going to do is I'm going to provide an exception here, right? And I'm going to go ahead and actually document the exception. But the more critical part here is I can go ahead and actually time box the exception, right? So in that sort of Jenkins, sort of ecosystem, as we move through the process, we're saying, hey, this is moving from one stage to another. let's refresh the data that we have or understand or know about the vulnerability profile of the services within this application. Because remember, we've ingested the software bill of materials. We know where your vulnerability management system lives, and we can go out and query that and get it to refresh this data. That's where we're going to see these things, and then ultimately allow you to take action here, right? And so again, I think the idea behind this is we really want to make sure that we're giving you that level of visibility, and we're surfacing the alerts that are associated with these things, and saying, hey, let's go down the path of making sure that we understand what's happening and when it's happening prior to it getting out in the wild. Now, the other thing I can do here, if I want a more comprehensive look, is I can look at what we call the delivery bill of materials. Now here, again, we're tapping into the source code management systems that you're using. So SonarQube for source code analysis in this case, branch protection policies for GitHub and running a bunch of checks there as we pull data in. Code reviewer validation, source code provenance, right? So we're tapping into some of these things and making sure that everything is sort of within normal ranges, right? And if it's not, we're obviously going to fire off those alerts. The same thing with the build system. So we're tapping into Jenkins in this case, right? And we're looking at, sort of the new commits, and the again, all the pieces of information that we need, the build pipeline validation pieces that we're going to get from Jenkins, right? And the pipeline stages, unit test coverage if we're using SonarQube for that. Again, we're documenting here that all this stuff's done, and we're not asking you to change any of your tooling. We want you to continue to leverage Jenkins. You're comfortable with it. We want to continue to have you continue to leverage the rest of these pieces, right? But then we get into things like artifact management, right? And so again, we're looking at vulnerability assessments for the artifacts that are associated with this particular service, right? The dependency validation. Do we have unverified dependencies? Now, again, this might be one of those scenarios where you'd expect this verification check to happen further left. It probably will. But if somebody forces that through, right, we're there to catch those things, right? If somebody decides to get cute and said, oh, I found a new source for this, it's for whatever reason, this is what I want to use, we're going to go ahead and catch that, right? The same thing with vulnerability assessments. Again, because we've ingested the SBOM here, we know where these bodies are buried, for lack of a better term, and we know how to interrogate your vulnerability management system, because again, these are all points in time on a continuum, right? These things don't stop. Vulnerabilities continue to evolve, and we do the same thing with deployment. Like, when it comes time to deploying, in this case here, if we're using Spinnaker or we're using Jenkins or we're using Argo, we can interact with these systems. We can pull the information down. We can do things like image provenance check, right? So, hey, did the hash that was generated at the end of the build match that of what we're getting ready to pull from, say, Artifactory, and we're getting ready to deploy? Or is there the right digital signature there? So again, all these things we're going to be checking on prior to allowing these builds to go through. And then from an attestation perspective, we can sort of generate those reports. And again, this is one of those things where you don't expect Jenkins to do a lot of this work for you, right? You expect Jenkins to sort of be that scale machine that's going to churn out these builds and do a lot of that work for you in terms of continuous integration, unit testing, make sure that the build you get is valid. All of those things are going to be happening. But I think, again, once it leaves the grasp of Jenkins, it's between that, from a CI perspective, between that and when it's getting ready to be deployed, that's where all of this sort of fits in. And so we can very easily, go down that path. Now, the other thing I want to mention, guys, is because we now become this, before I move into the more security centric part of this, now that we've become sort of the system of record for all things deployment, right? We've become the New York Times for sort of how you're, the elements of your deployments. One of the other things we're able to do, and we call this basically vulnerability response, right? Or risk response management, where I could plug in a CVE. Let's say that there was a 0 day that suddenly disclosed. One of the first things I'm going to ask myself is, where do I have the affected libraries deployed? So because we have a data warehouse that we've created that ingests all this information, we're very quickly able to point out where these things are deployed, right? And I can carry that forward to the services as well, not just the applications. So again, I think, from a reporting and compliance piece, it's critical, right? Then we move into, sort of the deployment firewall pieces of this, right? And so, as I'd mentioned to you earlier, one of the things that we set out to do here and help our customers who are leveraging the Jenkins and other just sort of general workflow type of ecosystems, right? We wanted to be able to provide a facility that allows you to codify the rules that you need people to be following. And that goes beyond just the rules that you're asking developers to follow, right? They're rules that the organization is responsible for following, depending on the compliance frameworks or the certifications that you have, right? Making sure that you're not just, sort of hoping. It's more of a trust and verify type of solution. So here, one of the things we do is we start off with rules config, right? So we can ultimately build out these rules. Now we ship with a big set of rules that you can leverage right out of the box. We also have what we call a rules genie, where we're using generative AI to have you describe a rule, and then ultimately what we're doing here is we're using OPA to enforce these rules, and ultimately Rego is the language that you need to use in order to create these rules. We don't want you to have to do that, right? We'll actually generate the rules for you, or using our rules genie, have that generate the rules for you. But again, I think the point here is this is a set of rules that are put in place to make sure that the process stays on the guardrails, stays within the guardrails, right? That there's no sort of drift as it relates to enforcement of policies or enforcement of security procedures, right? And so this becomes our logical layer, and then our output becomes these alerts, right? So when we spot violations, right, we then want to go ahead and make sure that we are alerting on those violations. This goes back to, again, sort of exception management, right? And manage by exceptions, and saying, hey, there's an issue here. Someone needs to come in, evaluate it, decide what to do about it, and then the process either moves on its way, or depending on what that person has chosen to do, the process might stop, right? The process might stop, and they might say, well, I need to enter a JIRA ticket. This needs to go back to the drawing board. But again, we're catching that prior to it getting into production. And again, if you think about the deployment firewall as the mechanism to do that. So in our case, we have a couple of different ways to do enforcement, right? So some of our customers want that level of enforcement, only because they're operating at such a large scale and at such a velocity that they need to be in a position to stop these things from happening when something bad sneaks through. So for us, we can leverage integrations with CD tooling like Jenkins or Argo or Spinnaker, or if you don't want to stop it at that level, we can do things like leverage Kubernetes admission control to ultimately block deployments that have pending alerts. And like I said, I think as we create these rules, you can actually define whether a rule is an alert rule or a prevent rule, right? And so we're ultimately going to provide you with that as well. And then lastly, I think one of the things I want to mention as a nod to the developers is this idea of being able to simulate, right? So our ability to go ahead and actually simulate a deployment, and ultimately go down the path of saying, hey, if I want to go ahead and see and I've done all my other checks, let me see if this deployment is going to make it through. I can view the report and say, I'm going to get stopped here because I'm going to get dinged on some of these things, right? So again, we can allow you to simulate those things. And again, I think this all goes to sort of adding an additional layer of security to the CI/CD ecosystem, specifically here with Jenkins. So, oops, let me back to slideshow mode here. So with that all said, let me stop. And Mark, I don't know if we've got any questions in the chat.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Bob. And please, while you're putting questions in, please put questions in. Let's take a quick little poll to see where you are with your Jenkins. If you can please answer the poll while we talk about it. Bob, it's pretty interesting with Jenkins. It's such a well known and implemented application's been used for years. Trying to look at sort of the vulnerabilities of it, I'm thinking specifically like in the plugins. I mean, how many plugins are there? And they can introduce their own vulnerabilities. So how what kind of strategies can you implement and use in order to manage that kind of vulnerability?
Yeah, and I think quite frankly, Mark, I think, and this is one of the areas where we're actually evolving the product, right? I think our initial focus was really around looking at your code and looking at your deployment process and looking at the artifacts that were generated. We actually, to your point, are now taking a step back, especially in the context of things like Jenkins, Spinnaker, Argo, where there is a very vibrant open source community. However, you know, people are, being encouraged to sort of submit code on their own. And, ultimately when your build system has vulnerabilities in it, that creates another soft spot. So I think for us, one of the things I didn't show, because it's still sort of something that we're toying with how we want to do it, is let's evaluate the health of the build system itself, right? Like, what plugins do we know about that are vulnerable, or what plugins do we know about in that ecosystem that could potentially cause a problem? So that goes back to the, wanting to make sure we're covering the entire life cycle and the entire supply chain, right, as it relates to that, is looking at those things themselves. So yeah, I think it's a great point, and I think it represents yet another attack surface when it comes to these things, right, and something that we need to be vigilant about.
Yeah, you mentioned attack surface mean, and that's a good observation with Jenkins, because you can have exposed Jenkins servers. There's script vulnerabilities. We mentioned the plugins, credential leaks,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
And a big one is misconfigurations. How do
That's
you
right.
check
Yep. That
that?
that and that happens both, quite frankly, Mark, left and right of deploy, right? So it's like, hey, do I have a misconfiguration that's now on the build side and the CI side that's now exposing or representing an area where a bad actor could then exploit something within that, right, and inject something further to the left of the whole situation. But the same thing happens, sort of right of deploy too, right? Whether it be, and for us, we don't want to, sort of cross over into operational security. However, pre-deployment, there's nothing wrong with, and something that we're going to do is looking at things like, hey, what is this Terraform script going to do? Am I making changes to the deployment, to the underlying infrastructure as code, right? Or, from a perspective of, if I want to do a progressive deployment and I want to go ahead and roll this out region by region, there's no reason why, and we're actually doing this today. It's something that OpsMx has really developed a great reputation around, is being able to say, hey, let me ingest data about that progressive deployment and spot anomalous behavior, right? So if I start to see log entries that I wasn't expecting, right, or I start to see odd resource utilization patterns, for me, that becomes another opportunity to sort of stop and make sure that we again, manage by exception, but bring someone to the fold. And if you combine that with some of the work that we've done around machine learning and natural language processing to sort of better understand our ability to sort of learn as we're ingesting this data, to reduce that on false positives and sort of other aspects of this, I think it's really an exciting story there. But I think, to your point, the configuration piece is sort of bookended on either side of the whole process.
Right. Right. Well, we have one question from one of the attendees, and perhaps he wanted to learn, want to learn more about vulnerabilities management tools, and sort of maybe you can talk about the tool chain in general and how OpsMx fits into the tool chain with this.
Absolutely, yeah. So vulnerability management tools are the cornerstone of any great security protocol, right? So, because that's one of the things that you have to have, right? And so when we look at this, Our approach has been, hey, if you haven't made a decision around something like this, one, we'll be more than happy to make a couple of recommendations, or two, there are open source alternatives that we've chosen as priority to integrate with, right? So that a customer can come in and say, let me see what this would look like if I start to do some of this work. But I think for me anyway, when you look at sort of open source, or you look at commercially available vulnerability management solutions, I mean, one, I think that's where those tools have to do a great job of doing things like building an SBOM and then ultimately tracking that SBOM. They should have coverage both from the commercial and open source scenarios, right? So they should have the ability to say, hey, I'm using these open source libraries. Let me go ahead and do that. And then they also should be really good at identification, right? So there are some out there that will try and do things like identify, depending on the programming language, identify the code based on either some unique identifiers, or to be able to create hashes and compare that to some database. But there's others that sort of take the more tried and true way of, and again, it depends on the language these things are written in, are just going to say, hey, let me interrogate the POM file. Let me go ahead and look at some of the build documents that are being generated by the developer, to sort of then extract what libraries are being used and bump those up. So I think when it comes to vulnerability management, there's a lot out there, but I also am very big believer in the fact that we have a very strong position, because we are there to make sure that that tool gets utilized to its full extent, right? We're not just gating a code check-in. We're repeatedly looking for changes or deltas, because again, that landscape is very dynamic. So hopefully that was helpful. And if there's some offline questions, I also I've got some background. I worked for a lot of years with Black Duck. So I'm very familiar with the vulnerability landscape, the open source licensing landscape. So if there are folks here that have questions about that stuff, be happy to help there as well.
Yeah, please. Anybody, if you want to have more of a deeper conversation about secure software delivery, uh, head to our website, and there's a button you can click to notify and hook up with Bob and team, have a deeper discussion in security. So I hope you enjoyed today's webinar. Bob, thank you very much. That's an important topic. I want everybody to have a great day. Thanks, Bob, and everybody else. We'll see you next time.
Thanks all. Take care.
See ya. Bye bye.